in the conversation. We got a lot to unpack today. Hello, YouTube. Welcome to the Lurie Daniel Favor Show on SiriusXM's Urban View, where talk empowers and becomes action. Urban View. Listen, y'all, we got to have a conversation. Amina, please get the moderation together because the National Urban League, and this is something that I talked about a bit in my podcast, Lurie Breaks It Down, where you can get that podcast, Lurie Breaks It Down, anywhere you get podcasts, Apple, Spotify, SiriusXM, what have you, on the Women's Empowerment Network. One of the things we have to talk about, and I mentioned this last week, but I did not talk about it on this show, and that is the fact that the National Urban League has declared a state of emergency for Black America, because I don't know if you've noticed, but we going through some things right now, and it's not just the Black economy, which I talked about extensively in Friday's podcast episode, and we'll do a bit more today. In that episode as well that comes out later this afternoon. But one of the things we have to talk about is what it means to be in a state of emergency when the state of emergency is related to our community's ability to get its needs met. Okay, now remember, we have this concept that I have talked about extensively. It's a framing concept, and it basically is a concept that says, think about all of the resources that we consume. Think about all of the services that we consume that we do not provide to ourselves. And I want you to now think about what happens when the people who do provide those resources decide they no longer want to do so. And instead of providing those resources, they're going to withhold the resources. They're not going to share them. They're taking their ball and going home. They don't want to play with us in the sandbox anymore. How quickly could we provide those services for ourselves? And we have to think about that because we're in a moment right now where, child, what's today? Today's Kwanzaa principle is Nia. And the Kwanzaa principle of Nia stands for what? Purpose. And what does that principle say? That we must make our collective vocation the building and developing of our community in order to restore our people to their traditional greatness. And when you think about what the National Urban League's call for the state of emergency is highlighting for us, you realize that the principle of Nia is going to matter so much more. So I'm looking at page 7 of their report, and it's again called State of Black America, State of Emergency, Democracy, Civil Rights, and Progress Under Attack. And when you think about the fact that we've been talking a lot about those 300,000 Black women who lost their jobs, we've been talking a lot about the fact that Black men and Black women have seen unemployment pretty much double in just the first 6 or 7 months of this administration. You realize just how dire this situation can be, because unfortunately for us, when we had an opportunity to maintain our own stores, shops, and other businesses at the outset of integration, many of us chose, for a variety of reasons, this is not about shade, this is not about judgment, but many of us chose to instead go drink water from white cups with white ice. And we can talk about the nature of those decisions. We can talk about what it was that was within us that caused us to feel like the white man's ice was colder, what it was within us that caused us to integrate in ways that nobody else did. We fully integrated and was like, we got our own stuff, but damn it, we want yours instead. Other people didn't do that. And it makes sense that other communities didn't do that because none of them had been enslaved for 400 years or for up until that point, 300 years roughly. So we're in a situation where we have to think about what it means to have tied our economic sustainability, to tie our health sustainability, to tie our nutritional sustainability, to tie every single one of the elements, our physical infrastructure. What does it mean to tie our ability to have access to food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, education, to tie those things to access to whiteness? Like, we got to ask ourselves, what does it mean when our access to get healthcare is dependent upon our proximity to whiteness? What does it mean when our access to getting food is dependent upon our proximity to whiteness? What does it mean when our access to heat, to housing, to shelter, to water? What does it mean when it depends on your proximity to whiteness because we do not provide those things for ourselves? According to the state of emergency, in the chapter entitled What We Stand to Lose, they say the following, quote, "In many ways, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the true birth of American democracy. The landmark legislation broke generations of state-sanctioned redlining, racism, and segregation that prevented America from living up to its moniker, the land of the free." Now, I know a lot of people are going to say something along the lines of, Lurie, you always talking about voting and voting this and voting that, and it can't just be about voting. You're right. It's not just about voting. And the reason that Black people fought so hard for the right to vote was not because they wanted a piece of white Americana. The reason that the Blacks were fighting so hard for the right to vote was because in this country, because in this country, decisions get made based on votes. And if you are, let's say, the sheriff, and the sheriff is an elected position, and as a course of being a part of the sheriff and the policing apparatus in that community, we find out you also the grand dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. You don't get to be sheriff no more if we can vote, because we can't have the grand dragon of the Ku Klux Klan also being the sheriff, because we can't have you raising up a cross on our lawn, or you supposed to be the person person we call to get the people and arrest the people who raise up the cross on our lawn. So if you are a sheriff and the sheriff is an elected position, we black people need the right to vote because you don't get to be sheriff in our community no more. If you are a tax assessor and you are a card-carrying member of the Ku Klux Klan and you was at the past 3 out of 4 lynchings, and tax assessors are the ones who determine the value of our houses and whether or not they can get a refinance and whether or not they are appraised appropriately, whether or not we can expand the pipes and the amount of water that comes into the household. If all of that is determined by the tax assessor, and the tax assessor is an elected position, and you was at 3 of the last 4 lynchings, striking the match and setting the man on fire that y'all was lynching, you don't get to be tax assessor no more if we're voting. So it's not about Americana. It's about decision-making power. And so right now we're in a situation where, according to the report, quote, today those freedoms face their gravest threat since the Reconstruction era as the hard-won gangs of the civil rights movement are systematically unraveled. And I take quibble with their use of the word unraveled here because, as one of you have shared with me, I think it was one of the Nubians, y'all was like, Lurie, you keep using the word dismantled. Dismantled indicates something that can be put back together. Like you might dismantle a piece of furniture in one apartment so that you can move it to another apartment. You demolish something you don't plan on ever coming back. They are demolishing civil rights. They're demolishing civil rights. They are demolishing civil rights. They don't plan on it coming back. And what's important about this comparison between the Reconstruction era is that the Reconstruction era was the first effort of integration. It was America's integration 1.0. Right now, this integration period we had is 2.0. It's the second time they done tried it. The first time they tried it and they got rid of it bloodily. Okay, they got rid of it in acts of sheer and total violence. And considering y'all's president is now planning to flood the streets of Washington, D.C. because Tiny Sack, Little Balls, Grape Nuts, whatever the fuck you want to call him, has decided that apparently the story is that Grape Nuts, who was one of the Doge boys, the Doge boy just happened to see a woman, and I'm assuming in this story it's a white woman, being attacked by a whole group of thugs. And though there's no color attributed here, I'm assuming that in their version of the story, the thugs are blacks, the blacks. And so apparently, according to the reports we got over the weekend, Tiny Sack, Little Balls, whatever the hell you want to call him, saw this group of thugs attacking this white woman and decided to get involved and had his ass handed to him. But then by the time we got the story, it was also a little bit of a carjacking. I don't know, but then the picture that they put up of the persons that they're looking for, it's just one lone skinny black man. I don't even know what that black man was doing and why his picture is the one that was up, but apparently he is the one that they are now looking for. It went from a gang of thugs to just one skinny black man and Grape Nuts Tiny Sack getting his ass beat and handed to him. And that's why your president is now trying to flood the streets of Washington, D.C. with National Guard, FBI, DEA, and a whole host of other alphabet gang people, in a move that I think is going to be mirrored across the country generally, but this is the sort of effort that they're engaging in right now, and I am concerned as somebody who was a student of history about what this is going to mean. Going back to this report, almost daily, says the National Urban League, since January 2025, the federal government, at the direction of the White House, has set fire to policies and entire departments dedicated to protecting civil and human rights, providing access to equal education, fair housing, safe and effective healthcare, and ensuring that our democratic process is adhered to across the nation. What I need us to consider is what happens when racism is fully legal again. I need us to consider that. I need us to consider what happens when the Civil Rights Act is eviscerated, right? I need us to think about what it means when you no longer have an EEOC to complain to about discrimination at your job. I need you to consider what does it mean when you no longer have a court that you can go to complain about the racial discrimination that you experience in the process of buying a home or trying to get an apartment. I need you to think about, and I'm asking you to think about this because I know for a lot of us, we done already been discriminated against. Like a lot of us are living lives right now with all of these rules in place and we know that shit still ain't fair. But I want you to think about how much worse it can be when we have to declare states of emergency because the entire apparatus of civil rights in this country has been destroyed. Now, the report goes through a variety of ways in which we've already seen some of these efforts. It starts with the 2013 decision, Shelby versus Holder. And this was a Supreme Court case that basically got rid of one of the most powerful prongs of the Voting Rights Act. And I told y'all last week, the next prong, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act that's still left, they are trying to get rid of that in this Supreme Court term. So when there's no longer a Voting Rights Act in place, and it is now again considered legal to discriminate against black people at the voting booth, what does that mean for us practically speaking? Because again,
again, if you my age or younger, we ain't never seen this shit. Like we don't know what it is to experience these things in real time because we might have read about it. You might have seen Eyes on the Prize in terms of watching documentaries, but we have not lived in this moment, right? And they go on to talk about the fact that it's not just that. We also have the Section 2 cases that are coming up, but they talk about the Students for Fair Admission. This case, which basically said race-conscious admissions in colleges are done. And I told y'all at that point, even though this was a case that dealt only with college admissions, that it was going to spread to corporate America. It has spread to corporate America. So I know some of y'all be thinking I'm hyperbolic. I be right. And not because I'm perfect, but because I study history and I read books, I read papers, I read things that help me make to make a greater sense and understanding as to what's happening right now. They just got rid of the legal apparatus that says you got to consider diversity. They've gotten rid of the legal apparatus that has paved the pathway for every single one of us, and myself included, every single one of us to get what we've got. Now, some of y'all thinking, well, I ain't even got that much. I don't even know why you. That might be true, Cletus. It might be true, Vern, that you ain't got that much. I do not disagree with you. What I'm saying right now is it is going to get so much worse because we are in a time where they no longer have a legal obligation to even fake the front. They don't have a legal obligation to be equitable, to be equal. They don't have a legal obligation to do any of that. And that is one of the reasons why we now have this state of emergency being declared. And it's important because that is before we get to the Fair Housing Act. Those three pieces of legislation, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act, that's why we have integration. And they're getting rid of every single one of them. And if you think they're not coming for the Civil Rights Act, and the Civil Rights Act is just a piece of legislation passed in 1964 that says you can be as racist as you want to be. You just can't stop black people from coming into your store because they black. You can be as racist as you want to be at home, but you can't not hire black people because they black. You can be as racist as you want to be. You can't refuse to have them come into your hospital because they black. Once they get rid of the Civil Rights Act, what these people don't like us. They don't like us. They don't want us here, even though they brought us here and they can't do anything without us because they have no meaningful skills other than rape, thieving, and robbing. But they don't want us here unless it's in a slave apparatus, unless it's in a slave function. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean? What is it going to look like for your kids in school this year, right? How many of you plan on being a part of the PTA because you know there ain't no protections for your babies in these school buildings? What is it going to mean when you're applying for jobs? I got a son right now who's good. We signing up, finalizing classes, getting ready for college. Like, what does it mean? How are we communicating differently to people who are entering college right now, knowing they ain't going to have job opportunities? They're not. Like, let's cut the shit. They're not going to have the same sorts of job opportunities. Are we preparing them to also think about what is it going to mean to have your own business? I know that's the conversation we're having with our child. Yeah, you're going to get this degree, but you also going to have some skills to be gainfully self-employed. Right? You're going to get this degree, but we also need you to cultivate these skills and the other skills because you're going to need to be able to do for self. Are we having these conversations differently? These people just declared a state of emergency. National Urban League is not one of them groups that's going to be out like... They're not a hyperbolic group. I'm not trying to say they whack. They're not. They're amazing. They do phenomenal, amazing, wonderful, dynamic things all the time. Their local chapters are doing some amazing things. But when they are issuing a state of emergency, we should pay attention. They've got another chapter on how the war on woke is, quote, fueling systemic oppression and the assault on civil rights. And they talk about what happened after George Floyd. And I want to be clear, the George Floyd marker, the Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery marker, that was a marker and a significant point in time. But there was a lot happening prior to that as well that is also now being eviscerated. And we have this growth of far-right extremists. Tomorrow, actually, we're going to have this whole conversation about what it means to live in a white Christian nation if you've got a vagina and breasts and a uterus. Because they are now being very honest about what their plans are for women in this society. And if you thought Handmaid's Tale was a joke, I'm going to just tell you, it is absolutely 1,000% what they are planning. 1,000%. They don't want women voting. They don't want women working outside of the home unless you're black. Unless you're black. And so I know that there are some black men who are firmly in agreement with this idea that a woman's place is in the home and that's where she should be. Well, guess what? Black women won't be able to take advantage of that. Black women going to have to go out and work because every time there has been a moment where white women have been able to stay at home and black women also wanted to, white people would pass laws and force black women to go to work because white women were not going to raise their own children and clean their own houses. So black men, those of you who are attracted to this idea that women should be forced to stay at home, they don't mean you're women. And unless you planning on going somewhere else, then you better deal with the women that you got. And y'all going to have to figure this out. We are going to have to figure this out. But they are very crystal clear right now. And what happened, yes, George Floyd was a significant marker where there was an escalation in equity. There was an escalation in these conversations. But that was sort of the pinnacle of a lot of work that had been happening for decades. And right now we're in a situation where the lawsuits that have been filed, the efforts that have been taken, the executive orders under this administration, they have decimated our ability to secure civil rights enforcement. We ain't even talked about policing and having unlimited immunity. So when we're thinking about how we're framing our conversations with our young people, when we're thinking about how we're framing conversations within our organizations, when we're thinking about the fact that it's not just that they got rid of civil rights, they have radicalized the civil rights division. So it's not just that they got rid of the civil rights apparatus. They have now switched the civil rights approach to defending white people from discrimination from whomever. They don't want any. If a white person has to compete equitably with other people, it is unjust and unfair because they're white. And whiteness means you don't have to compete. You get to cheat. That's typically the way whiteness has functioned in this society. According to the report, quote, for decades, the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice acted as an enforcer of the rule of law. It protected Americans from discriminatory practices committed by the government and private corporations under its new leadership, says the report, because they got new leadership at the Civil Rights Division. Ain't no more Kristen Clark at the Civil Rights Division. Now, some of y'all was upset with the Civil Rights Division. I was as well, at how slow they moved under Merrick Garland. But they're not moving slow under this administration. They're moving in reverse quickly. According to the report, under its new leadership, the Civil Rights Division has been hollowed out and repurposed, transforming from a guardian of justice into a tool for political retribution. Within weeks of the new administration taking power, cases against election deniers who've tampered with the election equipment were dismissed. They are dismissing cases against people who tampered with electoral devices. And we putting our hopes in the midterm election? Have you thought about how the election machines get certified in your state? Have you thought about looking at what companies own the election machines in your state? You should think about these things if you're serious about voting in the next election. They talk about the fact that the January 6th cases, all those cases were suspended or pardoned. At the same time, they say the Civil Rights Division withdrew arguments from key cases that play a key role in the future of our democracy, including the Louisiana redistricting case. We've been talking about redistricting a lot. So it's not just that they're getting rid of civil rights as we know it. They are reversing civil rights, and they're only defending and advancing civil rights on behalf of white people. We should think about what that means. We should think about how that is going to impact our black asses in this society. We should think about what it's going to look like when we have to explain to our families or we have to explain to our communities why it is not only do we not have civil rights, but we are now being charged with violating the civil rights of white people. Have we thought about this? Are you discussing this report in your community-based organizations? Is your pastor raising reports like this from the pulpit? Y'all was just at church on Sunday, for those of you who went. Did this come up at all? Because if we're talking about the church as this space where we're supposed to have had this rich legacy of civil rights activism, what is your black ass church doing about this report? Is your black church, put it to you this way, are you even binding up the demons of white supremacy from the pulpit? Are you even praying about like the spiritual wickedness in high places and the principalities that we are wrestling against? Because we wrestle not against flesh and blood. That's what my Bible say. But is your pastor even invoking spiritual power against the principles of white nationalism? Are you invoking power to bind up the demons of white supremacy? I would bet most of them are not. Most, I would bet, are not. It's a state of emergency. Does it feel like an emergency? How many of you have heard about this report? How many of you are talking about it in your sororities and your fraternities? Are your social action committees having this conversation? I'm talking to my organization as well. All of them that I am a part of. So I got a whole ass microphone following. I'm in a part of a lot of organizations. Civil rights based, advocacy based. Are you discussing this? What does it mean when black people no longer have a civil rights apparatus to work with? Now, and again, some of you are going to be the extremes and say, we ain't ever really enjoyed civil rights anyway. Okay, well, here are some of the laws that we no longer have access to. Okay, you ready? The Civil Rights Acts, which we already discussed, the Voting Rights Act, which we've discussed, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. That is the legislation that says if you've got a vagina and breasts, you can get access to a line of credit without having somebody with a penis sign off on it. Because up until 50 years ago, 51 plus years ago, you had to have a penis-bearing person proof of your ability to have access to a line of credit. The Civil Rights Act of Institutionalized Persons. This was an act that basically said that you could find relief if you were confined in a public institution, a mental health institution, a prison institution. You still had access to civil rights. The Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and the Handicapped. The Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act. Section 102 of the Immigration Reform Act. That basically prohibited discrimination on the basis of national origin and citizenship status. The 1990s Americans with Disabilities Act. The 1993 National Voter Registration Act. The 1993 Religious Freedom Restoration Act. The Freedom of Access to Clinical Interest Act. The Police Misconduct Provision of the Violent Crime Control and the Law Enforcement Act. The Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Person Act. The Matthew Shepard and the James Burr. All of these are different pieces of legislation that make up what we now appreciate as civil rights. And now it's all being either abandoned or only advanced on behalf of white people. Have we thought about this? How are we moving differently? Those of you who are in very precarious situations at work, this should be impacting how you moving at work. You're not going to have an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the same way. Yeah, you'll have some state laws that you can refer to for those of you who don't live in states that are run by all Republicans. Sure. Okay. Yeah. Location is going to matter. Are you discussing this in your in your good government groups? We've had to tell coalition members that the coalitions that we are a part of at the Center for Law and Social Justice, sorry, but if you do not have a racial justice analysis on anything you are asking us to participate in, we cannot participate, because as an organization that is designed to meet the needs of Black New Yorkers, racial justice is going to have to be a part of everything that we're doing. Are you having these conversations in your workspaces, those of you who are part of advocacy organizations? Because somebody has to be sounding the call. The Urban League has put out that call. They have put out this report. How many of us are having discussions about it, are organizing around it, are factoring it into what our mutual aid opportunities are going to look like, and you are hopefully engaging in mutual aid preparation? Because we're at a point right now where the country is crystally clear. This country has decided they tried integration a second time for about 60 years. They didn't like it enough to keep it, and so they're not. And my question for us is, how are we preparing? How are we organizing? And I see somebody in the chat said we need to arm ourselves. Listen, I'm a fan of all the provisions of the Constitution, Second Amendment included, but arming ourselves ain't going to feed us. Right? Arming ourselves isn't going to get us access to health care. We're going to have to create independent capacities for all of the things that we no longer provide for ourselves. We are going to have independent capacities to do that. So for those of you who are Black and in the medical field, I'm sure if you got a job right now, enjoy your job, baby. But in addition to that, I need you to be thinking about what does it mean to build a parallel medical system for the provision of medical services for those of us who live in spaces where we're not going to have access to health care. For my legal community, keep your job, baby. I'm glad you got one. But what is it going to mean to create an independent and parallel system of justice when we can't call on the police ever again? What is that going to look like? For those of us who are in the education space, if you are a teacher, wonderful. You are faculty, fantastic. What is it going to look like to create a parallel system of education when our kids no longer get access to their colleges and universities, but you still technically have to have a collegiate or university background in order to get hired? Parallel systems are going to have to be created because we are not going to have the capacity to be able to rely in any way on anything other than ourselves. And for those of you who are my mental health workers, my spiritual workers, my healers, how are you creating systems that are going to allow us, that are going to teach us as Black people how to fall back in love with each other? Because at the heart of most of the issues that we have is the fact that a lot of us don't like being Black, and we don't want to be connected with other Black people because we don't believe Black people can win. How are you helping to create a parallel system of mental health, emotional health, and spiritual health care so that we are also learning to fall back in love with ourselves and fall in love with our communities? Whatever your talents, your gifts are, if you are an architecture, if you are an engineer, if you are an electrician, whatever your skill set is, how are you connecting with other people from our community in your professional spaces and having discussions about creating parallel systems that will provide us the capacity to have our needs met? Because if we are in a time, and I believe that we are, where these people have been able to say, man, I want nothing else to do, if they can say that, if they can say it and mean it, and not face any legal consequences, we have to be able to not just react to that, but we have to set our own agenda, an agenda that truly is for us, by us. These people don't put out states of emergencies unnecessarily. This is not a hyperbolic group. This is a very staid and legacy sort of organization when it comes to civil rights advocacy. And so let us ask ourselves, how are we preparing? How are we organizing? And where are the parallel systems coming from that are going to have to be created? Black plumbers, Black electricians, Black lawn care services, Black nurses, Black doctors, Black bankers, Black everything. How are you preparing to create a parallel system of service provision? Because if you don't do it, and if they stop doing it, then baby, I don't know what the hell else the rest of us is going to do. Right now, we are going to go to commercial break. However, Urban View, we will be right back. YouTube, please like and subscribe.